Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to The Post 60, the post-pop of Lewis Capaldi. Let me tell you how we got here. So, in my last video series, Outrider, I introduced an initiative whereby every 10 posts, every 10 videos, there would be a focus on an individual, a scholar, an academic, or a popular cultural figure. And we would read an interesting context in and through them like a lens. So I thought, you know what, let's bring that forward. Let's transcribe that moment into our current series. And look, I owe Lewis Capaldi a lot. Lewis Capaldi saved my life. I'm putting that on a t-shirt, but more of that particular story later. And look, I need to start with a recognition of how incredibly lucky we all are to live in this moment of post-popular music. We have the gift of living at the same time as Beyonce, Adele, Taylor Swift, and Lewis Capaldi. And these remarkable performers fight, and they fight hard to succeed on their own terms. They fight to make a living. For example, Taylor Swift re-recorded all of her albums to return the ownership to herself. So Taylor Swift succeeded where Prince and George Michael did not. Adele just simply runs her own timetable. She invests in public performance for a particular period of time, and then she completely disappears to enjoy the fruits of the hard work that she's done in private, completely away from the public gaze. Amazing. And then, of course, we have Beyonce, who's brought forward the histories of Tina Turner, of the Ronettes, of the Pointer Sisters, of the legendary Gloria Gaynor, to claim success on her own terms. She is a transcendent performer, transcending what's acceptable for a woman, particularly a black woman. And there is no doubt that she has produced some of the most innovative cultural productions of this century with Cowboy Carter, but also, I never actually got over this album. Look, I'm tearing up. Lemonade. This is a transcendent, remarkable performer. And then, of course, we've got Lewis Capaldi, a redhead, a ginger, born in Glasgow, unrecognised through the major labels, through his early career, performing underage in a series of pubs and clubs, and writing about and speaking about being a young man and fear and loss and loyalty and respect and concern and anxiety in a time of alpha males and cage fighting. Yeah. So we are incredibly privileged to live in this period. We live in a time, I get quite emotional about this, where popular cultural performers know their history, respect their history, and are moving us into a different pathway, a different direction. It's never been tougher than now to make a living as a performer, noting the exploitation of performers through Spotify, through iTunes, and through YouTube, where musicians are reified to that appalling phrase, content creator. Yeah, right. And you'll notice that the four performers that I've talked about already in this time of exploitation, in this time of streaming, still bizarrely, and this remains a surprise to me, still bizarrely committed to the album alongside all sorts of other alternative multimodal presentations. And these four were incredibly entrepreneurial. They fought and fought hard the exploitations from the music industry and configured their own balance of personal and public life. Fascinating. Now, I call this post-pop. This is a post-pop moment and indeed movement. And our gig today is going to look at post-pop and Lewis Capaldi. He has a history, certainly. He has a narrative, but we're going to shape that into a meaning to understand our time, our soundscape. So what is significant and tragic, and really why I thought, you know what, I'm going to dig in and we're going to have a chat today. We're going to have a talk about what's going on at the moment, because in many ways popular music and popular culture more generally has never been more exciting than it is right now. But popular cultural studies, the intellectual investigation of it, has never been more dire and truly dreadful. Why? Old ideas that were wrong, that were dated 40 years ago, are being repeated now with some digitisation and some identity politics thrown into the story. So to prepare, and it's a big post this week, to prepare for this presentation for you today, I've read hundreds of articles of journalism and they were absolutely rubbish. I've read 3, and I'll be kind, mediocre books about Lewis Capaldi and really poor popular music refereed articles. And I'm really inserting sort of heavy inverted commas around of all of this. And what angers me so much is that this peer-reviewed literature endlessly, article after article after article, read lyrics as if they were poems. Come on, stop this. I taught cultural studies for 20 years, first years. And in the 5th lecture of this first year course on popular music, I would in some detail explain how popular music exists as a textual system. It is not poetry. Lyrics are not poetry. The sonic system of popular music is much more complicated than that. I taught first years that. Okay, but as I did the research on Lewis Capaldi this week, the peer-reviewed literature, and there were about 40 articles from around the world, a couple of dissertations, and they analysed his lyrics as if they were poems. It's unbelievable. So the meta point of my gig today, with a big shout out to Dr. Leanne McRae, is look, we have outstanding popular culture at the moment and truly rubbish scholarship talking about it. So let's make a decision today as a family to stop this and do better. Okay, now we're going to return to all these issues shortly, but let's go for it. So Lewis Capaldi was born in 1996 in Glasgow, a singer-songwriter. He won both critical and popular acclaim, and he's had #1 singles in the United States, United Kingdom, and around the world. And what's important here is that these singles have stayed in the charts for a long time. And the reason for that is he has multiple audiences. Again, we'll return to that in a second. He's best known for the song Someone You Loved, released in November 2018, and he's released a series of EPs and, yes, 2 albums. But before we discuss sort of this success, we need to go to the pre-pop to get to the post-pop, and this is interesting. So Capaldi in 2014 was supported by the Scottish Music Centre that enabled and indeed subsidised his first tour, 3 dates I think it was, Hit the Road. And this was called the Hit the Road Project. So this is important early on. We've got public subsidy, taxpayers' money, public subsidy helping performers build their career, build a corporate, build a publishing career. So the same year, Lewis Capaldi recorded in his bedroom and recorded all these tracks on his iPhone and then loaded it up to his SoundCloud account. This matters. And then, of course, Ryan Walter heard this music on his SoundCloud and then flew from the United States to the United Kingdom to become his agent. Okay, so by 2016, Capaldi had graduated from the Higher National Diploma in Music, so that's about equivalent to a second-year undergraduate degree, but he had studied music. So as you can see, between 2014 and 2016, in the Capaldi story, we see lots of the cultural movements of that particular time. We see digital disintermediation matters a great deal to this conversation. He recorded music at home, loaded it up to a streaming service. You notice he didn't have a label, he didn't have a recording studio. He was then, though, supported by public policies, taxpayer dollars to start to commence a touring career, a performance career. So that's significant. Public support, public subsidies are present at the start. So as you can see, we've got, a bit of a live music thing happening. We've got disintermediated music happening. They're important. What happens next? Now, these two movements aligned with one culturally significant track, and that is, of course, Bruises, that was released in March 2017. Now, this was important. This was a completely independent release, no record company at all, and it went on to attract 28 million plays on Spotify. It is still the fastest unsigned performer to reach 25 million plays on Spotify. This is significant. Now, events like this are incredibly important. They show how, much to my amusement, corporate record companies have completely missed incredibly significant performers. And that's happened through the history of popular music. But now we get to hear these incredible songs and listen to these performers because we've got this deterritorialized, disintermediated, digital music industry. We can listen to this music. And even though Spotify is a shocking payer of musicians and sonic performers, at least it is an income stream. Now, only after there was no risk, remember, no risk at all, Bruises had got 25 million plays, then the Universal Musical Group decided that they might actually sign him, and was distributed through Virgin EMI in the United Kingdom and Capitol in the United States. Right. Now, the next innovation from Capaldi was that he didn't launch straight into an album. Very significant. He released a series of EPs. And again, that's the great gift of digitisation. In the hashtag old days, we used to have a single, we used to have an album with 10 tracks, and perhaps an EP that would have remixes, right? That was about it. But now with digitisation, all sorts of releases are now possible. So Capaldi released 2 EPs, Bloom and Breach. He also performed in a support slot for a series of well-known performers, including Rag & Bone Man and, of course, Sam Smith. Now, again, that is a very clever move. While he had a small set, he was able to perform in front of a very, very large audience with that small set. So that's excellent. And he was able to build up to a first album through a series of EPs. So the EP Breach was released in November 2018, and it included a very specific song, Someone You Loved. This became the biggest song of his career. He had entered not only popular music, but what I would describe as high popular culture through this track, and it stayed in the #1 slot in the UK for 7 weeks. Again, that's important. Multiple audiences will return there. And another track on the Breach EP, Grace, also gained great success. So by the time of the first album, there were already 2 wildly successful tracks, and Hold Me While You Wait was the first, in some ways the first release of this album. Now, this album was the highest selling album in the United Kingdom in 5 years. He won a series of awards, continued to perform live, performed at Glastonbury for the first time in 2019. So at the end of 2019, and I would argue this is probably the first misstep, at the end of 2019, this album was re-released with more music added, okay? And that included, of course, Before You Go, that went on to be a #1 song again. But when was that song a #1? January 31, 2020. We know what's coming next. So he sold out an arena tour in March 2020. Alone, he performed in front of 250,000 people. So this has been a remarkable popular cultural narrative, right? A young man recorded music in his bedroom, loaded it up to a streaming service, received millions of plays without a recording contract. Fantastic. He also then carefully developed a scaffold of EPs up to his first album, and in fact had 2 number ones before the album was released. Okay. Then the pandemic hits. And by March 2021, as the world was just starting to move once more, Capaldi started to cancel live shows so he could focus on his second album. Let's do this. So the second album is incredibly difficult to produce for many reasons, and we've known this for 50 years. Incredibly difficult to produce. You see, what happens is a performer or a band has a very long time to develop the material for their first album. They can test it in really rubbish clubs, small audiences. They can release duds and no one really notices. So they've got a lot of time to work out the best material. Great. But then, of course, the second album emerges and you have to produce material quickly, under contractual pressure. You've got a manager, you've got record companies, and of course then you've got a tour with dates that are already locked in. So you've got a whole series of very hard deadlines. Now, so this exists, this problem, the second album exists as a problem. Now, I've described this through my career as the Stone Roses effect. The Roses produced one of the greatest albums in the history of popular music, the Stone Roses. It was transcendent. It transformed post-youth culture. And then after the release of this album, they lost their way completely. Drinking, drugs, all sorts of new personal relationships and commitments, and the band started to have really serious rows. They did release a second album, obviously called The Second Coming, and shall we say it received somewhat mixed reviews. Now, on the supporting tour for that album, Randy and John Squires left the band. Okay, and yes, they did reunite, they did release a bit of music, but the Stone Roses are a one-album band. But can I say it is an astonishing album, a transcendent album, a transformative album. And just to give you sort of an academic inflection on this story, I talk about the Stone Roses effect a lot, and it does exist in universities as well. Now, I was on a promotions committee helping colleagues work out if someone, a whole group of people, should be promoted from lecturer to senior lecturer. And one particular academic had produced one remarkable academic book, a scholarly monograph. You know, great citations, great critical acclaim, fantastic, brilliant. And the chair of the promotions committee asked the committee, should we delay the promotion to see if they can produce a second book? I took a breath and said, colleagues, can I talk about the Stone Roses? Because this colleague has produced one remarkable book. Now, being able to do that once is an incredible gift. Can we ask anybody, can we expect anybody to do that again? Now, that's the nature, that is the truth of popular culture. If a performer gives us one remarkable song, one remarkable book, one evocative photograph, and it's captured a time, it's captured a place, it's given us meaning, it's given us memory, why would we expect that they could do that again? That's greedy. It's asking too much of scholars, it's asking too much of our popular cultural performers. So the Stone Roses effect had a huge impact on Lewis Capaldi. He produced one of the most incredible songs ever that changed the world. But we can see the impact of the Stone Roses effect through that Netflix documentary produced on Lewis Capaldi, released between the two albums. Of course, we didn't know the second album would be coming. And the title was How I'm Feeling Now. It is a horrific film. I've seen it over and over again. I've cried my way through it most of the time. To see the impact of stress, of anxiety, of fear on a young man, the pressure from the industry that he would do it again, that he'd produce another Someone You Loved, yeah, right. This song is a once-in-a-lifetime anthem. This happens once. We as fans, we as humans, should be grateful, should be appreciative that this human being has released this song and we were alive when it happened. Once is enough. Once is a gift. So this is what I call claustropop. Popular culture at the end of the world. The cost on a human being to produce popular culture like it is an assembly line. Now, if you notice, significantly, Beyonce, Adele and Swift have all refused this pressure in very different ways. And they fought the exploitation of corporatized popular culture. Now, Lewis Capaldi, though, did suffer through it. He was younger, and also, of course, early in his career, he had to manage a pandemic. So these are black swan events. The incredible part of this story, though, is that somehow Capaldi was able to produce a second album. And the first single, Forget Me, debuted as #1 in the UK charts. Astonishing. Pointless and Wish You the Best were also produced. These are great tracks. These are remarkable tracks and accompanied by videos. And significantly through Capaldi's career, he's got more ambitious in the configuration of his videos as well. So this is actually a story of incredible triumph. Managing fear, managing anxiety, managing a pressure most of us will never, ever comprehend. But then we've got to ask what's the cost of these incredible tracks on another human being. There were 3 years between these albums, and that documentary showed pretty clearly what happened during those 3 years. Now, notice what happens. Adele simply disappears in between her albums. She's gone. She's having a life. Good on you, Adele. Swift and Beyonce, through their many releases, if you notice, they don't go through the pre-publicity stuff. All of a sudden, quote, an album drops. For these two remarkable performers, they don't put up with the stress and the rubbish. When they decide it's ready to release, they release it. But Lewis Capaldi, probably because he's documented so much of his life as an unsigned artist through Insta, wasn't really able to enact what I describe as digital dieting. So just turn the dial off for a while. And by April 2023, there were 3 successful singles from this second album. By May 2023, though, he was cancelling gigs because of poor mental health. And by June 2023, he announced an indefinite break from touring. What happened? Well, Glastonbury happened. And while on stage at Glastonbury, he suffered an elongated series of tics that blocked his capacity to sing. Shared widely on social media, he attempted to sing his biggest hit, Someone You Love, and coughs so hard as a tick. Coughs and shoulder tics stopped his voice coming out of his body. Now, that famously, the remarkable crowd from Glastonbury, many of course who had seen the documentary talking about these issues, realised what happened. It was amazing watching the crowd in this footage actually. They realised what's happened and they started to sing the song back to him as an anthem of survival and joy. And it was moving and it was extraordinary. But it was the ending of a particular chapter for Lewis Capaldi, and it happened to be in public at Glastonbury. He was pushed, he was pummeled to produce that second album, and he did, but the costs are clear. He performed, or attempted to perform, the biggest hit of his life at the biggest stage of his life, and he failed. But as always, the failure is diagnostic. It shows the scale of the greed and the exploitation of these corporations and the pressure that they put on the very people that makes them millions and billions of dollars. The question, though, for all of us is, what can scholars, what can we do to enable an understanding of this situation and how we can all do better? What can scholars do? Well, there's a whole discipline called cultural studies with its origins in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Richard Hogarth, Raymond Williams, with a little bit of an inflection from the great historian E.P. Thompson, a bit. And the whole point was to explore the politics of culture, particularly the politics of working class culture. Williams described the word culture as one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the language, and just because we add popular in front of culture doesn't sort of make the word any clearer. But popular culture must matter to cultural studies, but the problem is it's mattered to scholars in different ways. Stuart Hall, through his work on the encoding and decoding of texts, stated that, quote, popular culture is one of the sites where this struggle for and against the culture of the powerful is engaged. It's an arena of consent and resistance. That is why popular culture matters. Otherwise, to tell you the truth, I don't give a damn about it. End of quote. Now, I recently deployed that quotation and a discussion of Stuart Hall and popular culture in a chapter for Manchester University Press, and I received some heat. I received some heat because supposedly, even though that was a direct quote, that's not what Stuart Hall meant. And by the way, that's why I always use direct quotes rather than paraphrasing, so that, you know, we're actually dealing with real information and real interpretation. You see, what happened was Stuart Hall argued that popular culture, he reified it only of interest to Gramscian hegemonic negotiations. Now, Hall only cared about popular culture. Trust me, he didn't like it or enjoy it at all. Hall cared about popular culture because it was a place of struggle where supposedly, quote, socialism could be enacted. Okay, now popular culture matters for a lot of reasons, more than Gramscian hegemony and far beyond a site or place where socialism can be constituted. Come on. But in the last 30 years, popular culture has meant more and more and more to citizens, and scholars have not been able to demonstrate this complexity, this power that's important. You see, popular cultural studies has been lost to cultural studies. The inelegant replacements have been creative industries and cultural industries, some identity politics, discussions about representation, So popular culture, therefore, only matters because of the representations of women or disabled crew or Indigenous crew. It matters for representational politics. Now, as we talked about in our post-endings trilogy, remember the impact of Baudrillard's simulacrum? The consequences of all of us living through re-representations, living through other people's representations? Well, think about it. Come on, let's do this. Think about it. Do you really believe that the problems of poverty, homelessness, unemployment, underemployment, that any of those problems are caused by representation? Is homelessness caused by representation? Now, I would argue representation is negligible. It's a minor issue in our era with huge structural problems. The representation of women in the media, who cares? No interest to me. What I'm interested in is how women are paid for the jobs that they do and ensuring equitable payment for those jobs. The other way in which popular culture is explored at the moment is with regard to how the state works with cultural and economic policies. So the subsidies that exist for television or film in particular nation states, the publishing industry and so forth. Now, all of these are important. I'm a big supporter of policies that create financial and logistical support for new performers in particular. So helping them when they're signing contracts, IP, copyright and so forth. Important. Great. But again, is that why popular culture matters? Our universities have now officially reached the level of embarrassment with regard to how we are teaching and how we are researching popular culture. For example, John Story's book, cultural theory and popular culture has moved through 10 editions. Let me state that again, 10 editions. Now, John Story, nice scholar, good scholar. And this book, in its first edition, was probably a solid textbook to teach media studies or cultural studies in second year, in the second year of an undergraduate degree, right? But this thing's gone through 10 editions, and I've read 9 of them. The 10th one's just come out. I've read 9 of these editions, right? So you notice there's no completely fresh book that explores the nature of popular culture, the nature of cultural theory now. No, we're just rehearsing all these old ideas. We're looking at representation, not reality. We're looking at identity rather than ideas. And we're not looking at the very complicated dance between sonic media and visual media right now, let alone theorisations of speed accelerated culture. No. Instead, John Story's book has moved through 10 editions. Now, as I said, I've read all of them, except the 10th. The 9th edition, what was added to the 9th edition? Hang on to yourself. Intersectionality and Black Lives Matter, Richard Hoggart and utopian Marxism, and an updating of the examples so that we're down with the young people. Are you kidding me? The textbookification of knowledge has had a catastrophic impact on the teaching and the research of popular culture. Basic ideas, lots of editions, no fresh, new reconfiguration of big ideas. And of course, an intensification of very basic focuses, if you will, on representation and identity politics. So popular cultural studies has become representational politics and identity politics. Now remember, there was another way, there was another pathway that we chose not to take. And of course, this was Steve Redhead's work in the MIPC, the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture. And he worked the seam to create a new political economy of popular culture, not representations, no interest in representations. And this included music, certainly, it included sport, but the spaces and the places of popular culture. And yes, there was some movement into cultural policy, into creative industries, but also sports law and entertainment law. But look at the state of popular cultural studies now. It's absolute rubbish. Popular culture has never been more interesting. Popular cultural studies has never been more dire. And here sits Lewis Capaldi. And the peer-reviewed literature and the monographs are rubbish. He deserves better. And you know what? We all do. Now we have Netta Gant's Lewis Capaldi Beyond the Lyrics, probably one of the worst books I've ever bought. And of course, Beyond the Lyrics, actually the book talks about the lyrics, but does not explore the complexity of sonic worldviews. You see, with no understanding of the voice, we need to understand the voice. And also Capaldi's commitment to remixes, for example, the odd, interesting video productions that are emerging through his career, let alone this important history of sonic media and disintermediation. The journalism, of course, focuses on Glastonbury, focuses on that profound fan moment where the crowd sings back to him. It was poignant, but it was also tragic that one of the most remarkable singers of our time, performing his biggest song, couldn't sing it. Now, Brian Levy's book, and I'm putting heavy inverted commas around book, probed how Tourette's have impacted on Lewis Capaldi's career. But there is that joyous moment where the fans sing back the song, we know that, until the tics stop. But you see, there's no context to understand the exploitation that exists in the contemporary music industry. The lack of funding for songs, should I say content? The lack of funding from content from artists on Spotify, or the pressure on a man to produce a second album when he had self-actualized so brilliantly the pathway into his first album. So there was a desire through all the literature to render a human being with an impairment, Tourette's syndrome, into a hero a wizard, triumphing over despair. There's no sense that we have to create this sort of ridiculous narrative to block the deep conversation about why this person was in this situation in the first place. I've always said our understanding of justice depends on when we decide to construct the beginning and when we decide to construct the ending. So, for example, the war on Gaza, the war in Ukraine, did it begin in 2023 or 1948? Did it begin in 2022 or 1989? And you see, once we've determined a beginning that we're feeling very good about in our narrative, then we can construct an ending that makes us feel comfortable. A person with Tourette's syndrome overcoming the odds. Right. Now, certainly Lewis Capaldi loved the fame, he welcomed the fame, but the pressure and the anxiety has had a huge impact on him, particularly on his mental and his physical health, and he's talked about this. So he had to step away, noting that Beyonce, Swift, but also Adele have much more control over their narrative, their beginnings, their endings, their mirror moments. And they maintain control over their lives and control over how much of their private life is rendered visible. So Lewis Capaldi revealed, I think, what's going on in terms of anxiety and expectations from the corporate music industry, and he expressed vulnerability and authenticity while he did it. So I think this honesty matters a lot in times of brittleness, of brutality, of semiotic violence. And Eddie Wright stated that, quote, the emotional resonance of someone you loved transcended cultural and geographical boundaries, turning it into a global anthem of heartbreak and longing. End of quote. Now, too often, as you can see, this emotional resonance gets sort of locked into an understanding of lyrics. We need to understand the importance of the voice. And the legendary Roland Barthes talked about the grain of voice. So think about the grain of voice. The difference between, say, Josh Groban and Bob Dylan, or Lady Gaga and Etta James. Some singers like Groban, like also Sinatra, emphasised diction and the lyrics, but just as many, think James Thrain, was not too focused on diction, but very interested in conveying words as a rhythmic device. So a voice in popular music is malleable. It mashes into melody and beat. The human voice in popular music is the ghost in the machine. The voice is disconnected from the diaphragm, from the lungs, from the tongue, from the mouth. The body is separated from the sound that it makes. But for sound to be converted into meaning, the products of the voice must be understood and recognised. So when our speaking voice becomes a singing voice, it defamiliarises the meaning system. Words are stretched and stripped and changed. So what is a normal speaking tone in speaking is very different when those same words are sung. So when we hear a voice, we summon a sonic world. The different registers open doors to us. So the chest register, the head register, the falsetto, and of course the whistle register. Let me explain what that means. Think about when Kate Bush in Wuthering Heights jumps from the chest register. Think about Aha's Take On Me, the jump from the chest register. And obviously anything by the Bee Gees, Rock On. And the whistle register, best accompanied by, and I listen to this song most weeks still, to be honest, Minnie Riperton's Loving You. Weird as. That's the whistle register. Then there are, of course, the singers who speak over the accompaniment. The legendary Richard Harris, Someone Left the Cake Out in the Rain, yeah. But also, of course, Leonard Cohen and Neil Tennant. But a voice survives after the death of the body that produced it. Think about John Lennon's Imagine and how those meanings have transformed after his death. So the voice soaks in memory and emotion. So analysing the lyrics becomes really simplified, reified, and the most basic and ridiculous way of thinking about the voice in popular music. So to finish our post-pop post this week, let me talk about a different rendering of Lewis Capaldi's musical career, demonstrating that music is so much more than the text. It is the context. Popular music is not defined by the text, the music. Popular music is defined by the audience. Now, Someone You Loved was released on November 8, 2018. I heard it the day after the release in Australia. Of course, Australian Day was one day later than the United Kingdom. And I listened to it very, very early at the gym on the 9th. Now, I was following Capaldi's career because I have been writing about his career in terms of success through disintermediation. So Bruises on Spotify was a great example for me of disintermediation. So I pre-bought his new EP and was getting ready to have a nice listen to it at the gym on the morning of the 9th. And I was on the treadmill. And I was 30 seconds into the song. And I was sobbing uncontrollably. Luckily, I go to the gym very, very early, so no one saw it. And by the time people arrived, sort of the mad cry, the mad cry and the sweat had all sort of become one. But let me explain why I was crying. The visceral response to this song. This song is the only text. Pick a platform, pick a media, pick a performer. This song is the only text that captures exactly how I felt through Steve's death. To be clear, it is the only text that I have come across that can narrate a loss of this scale. So this song slotted completely into the loss. When I teach popular culture to students, I talk about a textual system hooking into a social system, But what happened with this song is I had my social system, the textual system came in, it slotted in and clicked into place. It was able to heal the wound. Now, no other text, song or otherwise, has ever been able to capture what the death of a spouse actually feels like. And I'm not the only one. A whole series of Reddit feeds have talked about how this young guy from Glasgow happens to know what it feels like to lose a partner. Now, Lewis Capaldi had some sense, I think, about what he had written. He stated at the time, I wanted a song that was more general in terms of loss. Someone being so prevalent to your day-to-day life and then just suddenly not being there anymore. End of quote. Interesting. But what is clear when we watch the video for the single is that it was a song about how a young man feels when his girlfriend dumps him. Bless. And look, that's completely understandable because Capaldi at the time described his audience as being between the ages of 12 and 30. So of course that became the video's audience. So young love lost. Okay. And by the way, that's a great example of how the sonic landscape can have multiple audiences, but the video can arrive and truncate, restrict and frame who's meant to be the audience for this song. But then you know what? Something absolutely extraordinary happened. Lewis Capaldi decided that he wanted to raise awareness about organ donation. As you do, good on him. And he thought, I'll use this song. And of course, he just met a couple of days before a cousin of his father's. And of course, that cousin is, unbelievably, Peter Capaldi. Yes, that Peter Capaldi. And they decided to work together. And I would argue Peter Capaldi gave probably the greatest performance of his life. And that is saying something as a man looking after his dying wife and the consequences of grief and death on that human being, and of course the gift of organ donation to allow a little bit of his wife to survive. But I think what made the video so powerful is it captured, again, better than just about anything, I would argue, how grief and death operates in the day of the living. And you'll notice the practice throughout the entire video is his life is accompanied by his wife's heartbeat. There it is. So therefore, suddenly, unbelievably, I've never seen this before, the secondary audience for this song, the older audience, were then suddenly summoned and recognised and valued through the second video. And you see, that is right there, that is the gift of popular culture. It gets in the spaces between the notes. It summons texture around a grain of voice and a deep intimacy as we connect a textual system and a social system. This complexity, of course, has been completely ignored by the scholarship that's encircling Lewis Capaldi. What we've seen the lyrics analysed, we've seen a discussion of Tourette's. Now, we know better. And I think that's part of the anger I feel about how Lewis Capaldi, how universities, researchers, we have let this young man down. We know, we've known for 50 years, that we've studied it, the stress of producing a second album. We know about this, intensified by the pandemic. Now, Lewis Capaldi was already successful before he found an agent, before he was signed to a record company. He was already successful, and we need to remember that. He was successful in his own pace, in his own way. But the problem was neoliberal Fordism has attempted to squeeze him into a particular timeline and a particular way of organising sonic material like it's an assembly line. And it's had a shocking consequence. The stress of completing that second album was revealed overtly in Capaldi's interview with Steve McKenzie. He described his own life as, quote, living in fear, end of quote. And, quote, the more successful things get, I find I'm more insecure about my own abilities, end of quote. He's telling the truth there. Why aren't we listening? This doubt, this melancholy, this fear produces great music, but at what cost? So Lewis Capaldi really deserves outstanding scholars who can match his remarkable intellectual abilities. Instead, we get an article from Quadrant. Now, for my non-Australian viewers, hi team, Quadrant is a publication where bitter, twisted, divorced old men get together and have a good focused grumble bum about the state of the world. Makes for great reading, can I say. Now, Raymond Burns used Lewis Capaldi's Tourette's syndrome as the archetype of what's wrong with our universities, what's wrong with academics, what's wrong with disability studies, what's wrong with popular music. And he stated, quote, Tourette's syndrome's current poster boy is Capaldi, who outed himself during his recent Glastonbury set. Capaldi's attention-grabbing move was not greeted by social opprobrium, but rather enraptured celebration. Coming out with a disability can be a canny career move for celebrities. End of quote. Now, anybody who's seen that Glastonbury set, and I saw it live, anybody that saw that Glastonbury set and the Netflix documentary, How I'm Feeling Now, this is not a career move. This is antithetical to a career move. He cancelled a global tour that was promoting his second album. His tics have meant he can't sing live. This is not a career move. This is a tragedy. But what makes this even more disgraceful, colleagues, is Raymond Burns, writer of this article for Quadrant, is a pseudonym. So he's so gutless that he's written this article and he's not prepared to put his own name to it. And it gets worse. And it gets worse. Whoever this Raymond Burns guy actually is, he's described by the editor of Quadrant as, quote, a teacher with many years' experience teaching in Australian high schools. End of quote. This is so serious. A teacher is seeing disability as attention-seeking behaviour. Lives are destroyed by a teacher not holding the expertise to actually understand disability in the classroom. So Lewis Capaldi, through all of this, matters. In a time of the widest availability of music in history, the soundtrack selection that we make in our daily lives fills our gaps, fills us up, gives us meaning. Popular culture, including popular music, teaches us about life and about loss, about self and in society. It builds connections, community, and communication. But I hope through all this work on Lewis Capaldi that finally he is the reminder for us about the millions of golden geese that the music industry has killed. And killed them with greed, killed them with pressure. And remember, this pressure is put on the young, the inexperienced, the enthusiastic. Lewis Capaldi was able to produce unbelievably an outstanding second album. And unless the music industry sorts itself out, how will this man, and I hope he will, but how will he produce the third, the fourth, the fifth, the 10th, the 15th album? He deserves a career. So this is a wider andragogical lesson, actually. Popular culture is precious and it is powerful. Now, yes, it's corporate. Yes, it's for sale. But you know what? The meaning that we get from popular culture is not for sale. Popular culture doesn't provide real or true information, but it does provide a series of frameworks and positions, a lexicon to gain empathy, understanding, and comprehension. But it also opens out our mattering maps to a new way of thinking and, yes, a new way of being. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.